Tickets. Tickets, please. Step inside. Take a ride upon the Terror Train. All aboard, be fair warned. These rails house fear and pain. Find a seat, don't mind the heat. Just pray the lights stay on. Upon these rails, these bloody rails, in darkness lies no dawn. Yes, step inside, come crawl or glide. With us you shall remain. Upon this ride, this hellish ride, we call the Terror Train. Ticket, please. James Ward Kirk Publications presents Terror Train, Episode 111, Tennessee.
Welcome aboard. Welcome to my home. I am the disembodied voice, your ghost host, so to speak. Call me Terror. Welcome to my train. Be you dead, undead, or of the living. Tonight, boarding the train from Tennessee is Tony Bowman, an award-winning author, I am told. We must give Mr. Bowman extra special treatment. Shot treatment, that is. Tony reads a bloody tale of horror. Lovely, yes. A young boy discovers the train he shovels coal for is fueled by a most unusual source. Yes, this one is a spine-tingler. So, sit back, permanently, of course, and listen as Tony hands over his bloody ticket, which reads Tony Bowman, Night Train.
Ticket, please. Night Train. by Tony Bowman. About midnight, Tim began to think about turning back, maybe catching a ride on Interstate 40 instead. He'd been walking the rails through the Smoky Mountain countryside for almost 5 hours. He was cold, and, despite the full moon, it was dark as pitch. All of this happened because he didn't like the smell of meth cooking. His mom's latest boyfriend had turned their tar paper shack into a meth lab, leaving him with 2 choices: face the man down, or head out on his own. The new boyfriend weighed in at 250 pounds. Tim weighed in at 140. Decision made. Ahead, the rails climbed a slight grade through a shallow ravine, with dark pine woods on either side. He wasn't especially claustrophobic, but he didn't like confined space like this. Midway to the ridge, a low moaning sound filled the ravine. It sounded like a woman wailing in anguish at first. Then the volume built, and Tim realized it was a train whistle blowing in the distance. The whistle blew again, a forlorn sound in the deep woods. He had been trying to hop a freight train since leaving his mother's house just before dusk, but the closest he had come to a freight train was 2 Norfolk and Southern coal trains that had lumbered by during his walk. He could hop on a coal car. It was difficult, but not impossible. However, lying across the exposed steel beams at the back of a car loaded with coal was a lousy way to travel. The beams were awkward, and you ended up covered in coal dust. Besides, the coal trains only went as far as Memphis, where he would have to hop another train. He held out hope for an open boxcar. He hoisted his old camouflage backpack, now more duct tape than nylon, higher onto his shoulders, and ran up the tracks. The cold air bit his lungs as he crested the ridge and looked across the mountain meadow beyond. Out of breath, he stopped and stared at the train. It was old, of that he was certain. Not a freight train at all, but an old-fashioned passenger train sitting still on the tracks pointing west. The cars were ornate, looking something like from the late 1800s. Certainly no newer than the 1920s. Pale yellow light shined through the dusty windows as he drew nearer. His breath appeared in white puffs as he crossed the distance to the end car. He could hear low sounds from the car, laughter and music. The voices were impossible to discern, and the music sounded tinny, like something played on an old Victrola. He reached the steps that led up to the rear of the last car, and reached out to grab the wrought iron handrail. "What are you doing, boy?" a deep voice asked. Tim looked up to see a tall, thin man standing at the top of the steps. He was dressed in an old black conductor's uniform. In the meager light, Tim could see the man's mouth, but his eyes were in the shadow of his cap. "I asked you a question, boy. What do you think you're doing?" I wasn't doing nothing, mister," Tim lied. "Oh, yes you were. You were getting ready to climb on the night train without an invitation. That is strictly against company policy, and I'm a company man." "No, sir, I just wanted to look. I ain't never seen a train like this, except in a movie." "Lies are the path to hell, boy," the man said. Tim sighed and looked down at his feet. He let go of the handrail. "Yes, sir. I was going to hop the train. I'm sorry." The man laughed, deeply, without humor. "Nobody rides a car in the night train without being invited. This here is a special train. Why do you want to ride?" "Well, I'm leaving home, and I ain't got money for a ticket. I'm just trying to get out west, make a life for myself." "Well, you haven't been invited, so you can't ride with the passengers. You a slacker, boy? Smoke that weed? Drink?" "No, sir." "You got a strong back?" You look puny from where I'm standing." Tim straightened. "I'm stronger than I look." The man nodded in the darkness. "Yeah, you might do. Go on forward to the engine. Mr. Sharon lost his fireman today. He needs help keeping this old train running. You tell him Bub sent you." Tim smiled and backed away from the ladder. Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me, boy. You ain't seen the job yet." Tim ran down the line of cars. He tried to get a look inside as he jogged along, but all the windows were too dusty to see anything clearly. Once he thought he heard a woman crying, but it could have been the wind. Steam billowed around the engine, which was as old as the cars it pulled. A 19th century steam behemoth, belching white clouds onto the moonlit track. Inside its steel corpse, Tim could hear the sound of thrumming pistons and turning gears. On its side, painted in red flowing script, was a single word: Lilith. Tim slid to a stop in the loose gravel around the railroad ties as he passed by the coal car. A fat man stood on the ladder to the engine's open cab. "Tempus fugit, Mr. Sharon. That means time flies." A voice growled from inside the cab. "I know what it means. I'm not illiterate, Mr. Mobius." "No, what you are, boy, is late. At this rate, it'll be 3 a.m. before we reach Memphis, and I will not have a repeat of the Las Vegas incident, Mr. Sharon. Not on my watch, sir. We're out of steam because you and the rest of them fat cat sons of bitches won't put some damned condensers on my Lilith. Now get your fat ass back in the lead car and get out of my way," Sharon said. He appeared from the darkness and stood over Modius. Modius glared at him and snapped shut his pocket watch. "Tempus fugit." The fat man dropped down on the gravel beside Tim and glared at him. "Who in the hell are you?" Tim took a step back. Tim Curtis, sir. Bub said you need a new fireman." Modius's look softened. Oh, of course. Well, welcome aboard. Take care that toothless bastard don't throw you off like the last one." He waddled past and climbed up into the lead passenger car. Tim looked up at Sharon. He was a thin man, barely any bigger than Tim was. He smiled down, revealing a mouth with teeth only on the right side of his face. "Bub sent you?" Tim nodded and took hold of the handrail. "You even know what a train fireman is?" "That's the guy who shovels coal?" Sharon smiled. "Yeah, he shovels coal. Now get on up here. They've just about finished jerking water from that stream." Tim climbed up into the cab. Long shadows were cast on the floor and walls by the low-burning coals from the open door under the boiler. Sharon pressed a soot-covered shovel into Tim's hand. "Just don't stand there. Get to shoveling." Tim nodded and tossed his backpack onto the floor of the cab. Coal lay strewn across the floor that led back to the coal car, and he began to shovel in earnest as Sharon sat down by the brass throttle and looked out the right side of the cab. "Look at 'em out there. Been carting water for an hour," Sharon said. Tim leaned out and peered into the steam-laden night air. Tall, skinny shapes ran through the darkness, carrying leather bags full of water up from the stream below the bridge ahead. And who are they? Passengers. From the cheap seats in the back of the train, he reached up and pulled a chain. The loud whistle reverberated through the small cab. Tim winced at the sound. "All right," Sharon yelled at the window. "That's enough. Get back to your car, or you walk." The dark shapes ran through the steam back toward the train. Tim watched as, one by one, the leather bags landed with a wet slap on the floor of the cab. The passengers were tossing the bags in as they ran by. Tim caught sight of a thin gray hand with long fingers that reached through the steam and laid a bag down with the rest. The nails were long and ragged. "Hey, get to shoveling, kid," Sharon said. Tim looked warily at the space where the hand had appeared, then slid his shovel back into the coal pile and set to work. Sharon smiled. "There we go, Lilith, my love. Fire for your belly." He kicked the coal door shut. "That'll do for a while." He ran up the throttle and grabbed the massive gear lever. He pulled it back, and the wheels began to turn with a squeal of metal on metal. Lilith lurched, then sighed as the wheels caught on the smooth tracks. The train began to move, and then pick up speed. They crossed the bridge and began to roll faster. As the last passenger car passed over the bridge, Sharon looked back down the tracks and began to laugh. "Run, you godless son of a bitch!" Tim peered out over his shoulder. In the distance behind them, one of the passengers was running down the tracks after them. Sharon blew the train's whistle again and pushed the throttle farther. "He ain't gonna make it. Nope." The shape stopped running and dropped to its knees on the tracks. "Ain't you going to stop for him?" Tim asked. "Nuh-uh. If he's still here tomorrow evening, we'll pick him back up. Night train ain't no place for the slow-witted." He held out his hand. Lou Sharon." Tim took his hand and smiled. "Tim Curtis." In the dim light, Tim could see that it wasn't real teeth missing from Sharon's smile. Half the molded teeth were missing from his ill-fitted dentures. "This here is Lilith, rolled out of the Purgatory Steam Works on June 6th, 1606. I didn't know they still used steam engines like this. Lilith here is special, ain't you, darling?" He caressed the bulge of the boiler with a gloved hand. "Like some kind of exhibition train or something?" Tim asked as the train sped through the Smoky Mountain night. "Of a sort. Her passengers pay a heavy price to ride her." Lights flashed by and Tim jumped. The scenery outside was roaring by much faster than he would have expected. What was that light? "Knoxville. You like music?" Tim looked out at the ground. It was a blur of green and muted gray. "Yeah, I like music." Sharon reached up and turned the knob on an old radio. The dial lit up bright yellow. The sound from the speaker was tinny and laced with static. Words came through. "You're listening to 650 AM WSM from Nashville, Tennessee. Welcome to the Grand Ole Opry." "You do like country music?" Sharon asked. "I prefer classic rock." Sharon frowned and opened his pocket watch. It was gold, with a 5-pointed star engraved on the back. No, not right now. Now you get country out of Nashville." The radio blared on. "We got a special treat for you tonight. Mr. Johnny Cash is going to sing Folsom Prison Blues from his new record." Tim grinned. "Must be some kind of old recording." Sharon smiled at him. "No, it's live." Johnny Cash began to sing. Tim stared at the radio. "But Johnny Cash has been dead." Sharon interrupted him. "I did a stint in Folsom. While back, though, before the night train." "Well, that can't be live. Johnny Cash is dead." "Oh, he will be by the time we hit, let's see, Little Rock." "Huh?" Tim stared at Sharon in the red-orange glow of the fire. "You a smart man, Tim?" "I suppose." "Well, train travel is all about dimensions. See, a single train track is one-dimensional. You add switches and spurs, that makes it two-dimensional. You allow a train to be on a specific piece of track at a specific time, then it's three-dimensional. You follow me?" "I guess." Lilith adds a fourth dimension for herself. That's why I can cannonball down these tracks and not have to worry about running into some freight. Lilith just goes to some time when there ain't no other train on her section of track. Tim laughed. "You're messing with me. That ain't possible." Best to shovel more. We need more steam to make Memphis. Johnny Cash finished singing Folsom Prison Blues. Static hissed from the radio, and 1955 became 1962, as Patsy Cline sang Crazy. Never, ever open that top door, Sharon said as he pointed to a larger version of the coal hatch set in Lilith's iron belly. I'm the only one that opens it. What's it for? Tim asked. Never you mind about that. Tim set down his shovel and looked at the firebox and boiler that dominated the front of the cab. The iron had been painted with thick black paint, but the intense heat of Lilith's guts had caused the paint to blister. Furrows and wrinkles radiated this way and that, like veins just beneath her metal skin. Valves and gauges spread haphazard, like steel growths, their arcane functions undiscernible. Above the coal door, the larger door he was not to touch, glowed a gentle pink from the heat within. Beside it was a large brass valve, a 5-pointed star embossed on its surface. Where will we be in the morning? Tim asked. Steam hissed like a woman's laughter in the cab. Won't be no morning. Night train travels by night, not by day. Tim shook his head. Aw, come on now. You've been pulling my leg since Knoxville, Mr. Sharon. Sharon scratched at the back of his neck. All right. By the time it's dawn here tomorrow, we'll be in a place called Troitskoye. Where's that? Eastern Russia. Tim rolled his eyes. Okay, fine. Keep having fun with me. Sharon leaned out the side. You want some fun? We'll have us some fun. Memphis, Tennessee. The night train pulled to a stop at the Memphis train station. Tim looked out as passengers disembarked. He couldn't see any of them clearly through the steam. They seemed to be wandering with no clear purpose around the station. Sharon picked through a cigar box by his seat. He held up a pair of small dentures and popped them into his mouth. These don't fit for shit, but at least there's 32 of them. He turned to Tim and smiled with a mouthful of small white teeth. How do I look? Tim nodded. They look good. It was clear the teeth were not made for him. Well, what are you waiting for, kid? You coming with me to get some tail? I don't know. Sharon rolled his eyes. Come on, boy. We've only got an hour before we have to move. If we don't find something long and leggy here, we'll be waiting till Muskogee, Oklahoma. Oh, where are we going? I ain't got no money, Tim said. Bar I know. Girls dance in cages there. Call them go-go dancers. You'll love it. Sharon opened the cigar box and rummaged through it. He handed Tim a thick roll of bills. Night train pays good. The place they had gone was exactly as Sharon had described, and 45 minutes later, they walked back into the station along with 2 of the girls from the bar. The girls had been dancing in cages in patent leather go-go boots and big hair done up in layers of aquanet. The girls hadn't paid any attention to them until Sharon started flashing a roll of bills around. Works every time, he had said. Tim walked hand in hand with his girl, a tall brunette named Doris. Sharon had his hand on the other girl's butt as they walked a few yards ahead. Every once in a while, Sharon would whisper something in the blonde's ear, and she would laugh, and occasionally slap him. You're lucky you haven't been drafted, Doris said as they walked toward the train. Drafted? Tim asked. You know, the war. Vietnam? You know, that thing on Huntley and Brinkley every night? Doris said as she ran the lacquered nail of her index finger down the palm of his hand. You're not too bright, are you, honey? Anyway, my girlfriend up there, Betty, that's where her husband is. Tim stared at the woman walking with Sharon. She's married? Doris laughed. Oh, it don't matter to her. Well, girls, here she is. The love of my life. Lilith, Sharon announced. Hey, I thought I was the love of your life, Betty said with a giggle. Darling, you will always be dear to my heart. But Lilith's love, that is forever. Oh, pleased to meet you then, bitch, Betty said in a mocking voice and curtsied. The old engine growled and belched out a thick cloud of steam, causing Betty to squeal in fright. Sharon laughed. Best not to tempt her, darling. She's a jealous woman. Mr. Modius was climbing down from the cab as they walked up. He smiled at the girls, looking them up and down for far longer than was decent. He then looked at Sharon and tapped his pocket watch. Tempus fugit, Mr. Sharon. Oh, don't you worry, Mr. Modius. This won't take long at all, Sharon said as he put a hand on Betty's mini-skirted butt and helped her up the ladder. It better take a while, Betty said with a laugh. Sharon slapped her butt as she disappeared into the cab and then climbed up after her. Doris grabbed hold of the handrail and pulled herself up. She looked back at Tim. You coming? Don't you want to go someplace else? She laughed. Nope. Tim followed her up into the cab. Sharon was standing behind Betty, his body pressed against hers. Now down here, this is where we shovel in the coal. Oh, is that right? Betty asked, as she leaned back against him. She kissed his neck. The boiler made a low, groaning, growling noise. Sharon smiled. Darling, you'd best not to kiss me. Like I said, Lilith gets jealous. She grinned at him. The old whore is just going to have to wait her turn. Doris put her hands around Tim's neck. What's wrong, honey? You shy? Tim smiled. Well, a little. Yeah, I ain't used to kissing a girl with people watching. Sharon pointed at the big door above the coal door. Oh, now you gotta see this. He reached down and opened the door. The cab was filled with a red glow. What is it? Betty asked. Look in it and see. Tim looked around Doris's head at the open door in front of Betty. The walls within were pink and steaming. The bottom of the chamber seemed to glisten. What the hell is that thing? Betty asked. It smells in there. Here, take a closer look, Sharon said. He crouched down behind her, grabbed her ankles, and threw her head first into the opening. Betty screamed out, her skin sizzling as she slid into the opening. Sharon put his foot against her butt and shoved, sending her all the way into the chamber. She screamed in agony as he slammed the door shut behind her. He turned and laughed at Doris and Tim as Betty shrieked. Sharon's eyes were wild. Oh, my darling does love the slutty ones, the foul-mouthed ones, the harlots, fornicators, and adulteresses. Yes, she does. He reached out and grasped the valve with the star on it and turned it to the left. The door glowed bright red, and Betty's screams merged with the whistle of the train as Sharon blew it again and again. Eat your fill, my love. Doris stared at the glowing red door, her screams drowned out by the sound of the whistle. Sharon reached out and closed the valve. The door faded from red to pink, and he opened it again. The walls within were wet with moisture. The bottom of the chamber quivered, and items began to fall to the floor. Rings, earrings, change from Betty's purse, and a set of dentures. Sharon picked up the items and dropped them into a cigar box. He looked at the dentures, wiped them on his shirt, and then swapped them for the pair in his mouth. She looked like she had big teeth. I was right. He smiled with Betty's teeth. Your turn, kid. Doris screamed, turned, and began beating her fists against Tim's chest. Let me go. Tim looked at Sharon in confusion. I can't do this. Sharon shook his head. Make your choice, boy. Tim held Doris's wrists. Calm down, calm down. Doris began to cry. Just come with me. We'll get the police. Tim shook his head. I got nowhere else to go. Sharon grabbed her under her shoulders and lifted as Tim grabbed her ankles. They maneuvered her feet first into Lilith's mouth as she screamed. Tim could swear he heard Lilith giggle as they slammed the door just before Doris's hair caught fire. "You gotta turn the valve bare-handed," Sharon said. Tim reached out, feeling like he was in a dream. He grasped the valve. It burned his flesh, branding his palm with the 5-pointed star. "She claimed you now." "You're a made man," Sharon said. Tim slumped on the floor of the cab and watched the world pass by. There was no need for coal. No need even for water, now. Lilith flew faster and faster down the rails. Arkansas flashed by, followed by Oklahoma. One instant green, the next instant a dust bowl. Colorado and Utah were a blink as Lilith, her demonic belly filled with 2 souls, flashed through the west to Sacramento and beyond toward San Francisco. Sharon talked as the train roared through stations and meandered through time. Night train always chases the night, never touches the day. Those passengers paid a heavy price to not have to see the sun. And our Lilith, she doesn't disappoint, does she? Tim stared at his branded hand as the train left the rails. There was no look of surprise on his face, no comment about the impossibility of the situation at hand when Lilith skimmed over the black surface of the Pacific on her way to Russia.
Our next passenger to step aboard tonight's track is Rie Sheridan Rose and her poem of a very naughty train. Evil, you might say. A bloody ticket is handed to our conductor, which reads, Rie Sheridan Rose, the night train.
Ticket, please. The Night Train by Rie Sheridan Rose. Whistle screaming out of the night, banshee wail, finger bone scrape. Under the gibbous moon, curl of smoke, above death-black cars, streaking silver rails, laid through madness. Skeletal hands on the throttle, hell flames in the firebox, cowcatcher rictus of jagged teeth. Clatter-clack death rattle as the wheels strike sparks, sliding down the night track. Red eye malevolent as it searches for souls. The night train jumps the track when it hungers.
Yes, our guests have taken their permanent seats. From New York to time infinite. Are you ready to join them? Perhaps another story will lure you. Choose a car, any car, for the time we had a permanent guest, as they tell their tales of horror at its best. Come, yes, join me. My name is Terror, who rides the rails eternally upon the Terror Train.
Survived this trek? No turning back. Dare resist, just try. Step back inside, we'll be your guide. So many ways to die. Upon this ride, nowhere to hide. With us, you shall remain. Upon this ride, this hellish ride, we call the Terror Train. Terror Train Podcast, Episode 111, Tennessee. Produced by Krista Clark Grabowski, David Schutz II, and Mary Genevieve Fortier. Podcast directed and arranged by David Schutz II. The conductor, or narrator, was created by and played by David Schutz II. Terror, the disembodied voice, was created by and played by Mary Genevieve Fortier. Terror Train Podcast opening and closing poems written by Mary Genevieve Fortier. Host segment dialogue for Terror, the disembodied voice, written by Mary Genevieve Fortier. Production music, The House of Leaves, Chase Pulse, The Hive, and The Voices by Kevin MacLeod in Compotech.com. Featured works, Night Train, written by Tony Bowman, winner of an Editor's Choice Award. Production music, Clean Soul, Ghost Story, Ice Demon, Long Note 4, Night Break, Satiate, Static Motion, Classic Horror 2, and Land of the Dead by Kevin MacLeod in Compotech.com. The Night Train, written by Rie Sheridan Rose. Production music, Hush by Kevin MacLeod in Compotech.com. Additional sound effects by AudioSoundClips.com. Podcast program edited by David Schutz II. The stories and poems presented in the Terror Train podcasts are all featured in the James Ward Kirk Publishing Anthology, Terror Train, which was edited by Krista Clark Grabowski and A. Henry Keene. Cover art by Stephen Cooney. Content copyright 2014. Terror Train, Podcast Episode 111, Tennessee. Copyright 2014.